If you're starting your podcast journey, whether you are a new podcaster or you're launching your podcast, you're in luck because today I am going to break down how to actually grow your podcast fast. So welcome back to the Organic Marketing Simplified, the place where I help you take your podcast and turn it into a business asset. Today, like I said, is all about podcast growth. And these are the things that you need to focus on as a new podcaster so that you can actually grow your podcast sustainably and not waste time fiddling around with things that don't work. Let's do this. The number one tip that I have for you in order for you to grow your podcast fast is for you to stand for something. Now, I want to use my own podcast as an example here so that I can paint a picture for you. When I started podcasting, I was afraid of my gifts and the knowledge that I had. So I would really severely water down the content that I was putting out. I was talking about like freebies and things like websites, and I don't even remember what I was talking about. But if you go back and listen all the way to my very first podcast episode, I still have all my old episodes up. You're going to go and see that I was just very vanilla, very neutral. And then a few episodes in, I actually owned my gifts and I started talking about e-commerce, which back then it was what I focused on. So this podcast started off talking about Etsy and Amazon and those things. And once I actually started talking about something very specific, that's when our podcast grew. I have a client who she is Christian and she's unapologetically Christian, and her podcast gets thousands of downloads every single month because she's not afraid to be open about her faith and just talk about it. Whereas some people would be afraid to include faith or just to stand for something in their podcast. So don't be afraid to almost be polarizing, which I know can sound so scary and you can sound like you're a bad person. But the point I'm trying to make is if you're just trying to be pleasant to everybody and just accommodate everybody, then you're honestly not going to attract anybody. So make sure that your podcast, that your message stands for something, and just be clear and put it out there. And if you do get haters, you get haters. But at least you know that the people that are coming to you and listening to your podcast, those are your people, and you are going to get more downloads and more reach, and your growth is going to happen a whole lot faster. The second tip that I have for you is for you to stay consistent. Now, listen, so many people go into podcasting and they think this is going to be the thing that is going to catapult their career and it's going to put their business on the map, and beautiful things are going to happen basically overnight. Now, I'm here to tell you that podcasting is great. Podcasting put me on the map. I started podcasting with no listeners. Like seriously, I launched to an audience of 0. And then a few years later, I have a top ranking podcast. Now, why? How did I get here? I stayed consistent. So even when people were not listening, even when I was doing giveaways and nobody was entering my giveaways, even when like it was basically crickets, I kept going because you have to have the vision for your podcast and you need to understand that things don't happen overnight. So stay patient, stay consistent, and do show up and don't quit. Please do not quit after the 7th episode. Do not quit after the 3rd month. Keep going. Make a commitment right now that you are going to podcast for at least 1 year. But honestly, I even think that that is too short term. I think that you should go into podcasting with the idea that podcasting is going to be your main marketing platform where you put your heart and soul into this platform. And then all of your other content comes off of your podcast. So whether we're talking social media content, we're talking reels, we're talking carousels, whatever is coming out of your podcast, not the other way around. So you're not creating a bunch of content everywhere. You're literally showing up, you're creating one piece of content and you're recycling content from the main piece of content. So stay consistent, and actually treating your podcast like your main marketing platform will really help you stay consistent and not burn out, because that'll help you not have to create a ton of content for a ton of different platforms, because you know that every single week you just have to create one episode for this one platform, and then you get to book content for other platforms if you choose to jump on social media, which, by the way, I grew my podcast without having a social media presence. So if I can do it, trust me, you can do it too. When I say that I didn't have an email list and I didn't have a social media following, I had nothing, I mean it. And a few years later, I'm on the other side of that and I have a successful podcast. So consistency is key here. The third tip that I have for you to grow your podcast really fast is for you to focus on strategic collaborations. What does that look like? Well, it looks like you being on other people's podcasts and possibly having other people on your podcast. So if you know of somebody who's starting their podcast and you guys are in similar niches, go ahead and switch podcast episodes. So you go on their podcast, they come on your podcast, and you guys are sharing audiences, because that is really going to help you have really fast growth. And it's very smart because podcast listeners listen to podcasts. So if you are going to spend time growing a podcast, make sure that you're doing that inside of the podcast platform, not outside, because that's just honestly going to burn you out really fast. Now, when it comes to being strategic about the collaborations that you're doing, I actually did a whole episode, and this is episode 353. I will leave that linked for you in the show notes so you can go ahead and check it out. But I talk about how to actually use those collaborations to grow your podcast versus just having a bunch of random people in your podcast, which that is not going to help you. That's not what I'm talking about. So make sure that after this episode, you go ahead and listen to episode 353 so that you can actually have a really good understanding of what it is that I'm talking about here when I'm talking about doing those strategic collaborations. And of course, I have a bonus tip here, which is not a bonus tip if you have been hanging out with me for a hot minute, which is for you to focus on SEO. It is the number one thing that you need to focus on. And it's honestly the one thing that I mentioned in basically every single episode. And the reason why I say it so many times, and I'm starting to feel like my mom, because my mom likes to repeat herself 1,000 times, a trait that I do not like. But the reason why I'm pulling a page out of my mom's book is because people are not taking advantage of SEO. So if you think that you are using keywords strategically in your podcast and you're not seeing growth, I'm sorry to tell you that you're not really understanding SEO, and there's more work that needs to be done. And if you're like, I don't understand what SEO is, don't worry, I have a free resource and I always leave a link for you down below in the show notes. So make sure that you go ahead and grab that. But you really need to understand SEO and where to put keywords and how it all goes together so that you can have amazing growth on your podcast. This needs to be something that you're going to focus on from the beginning of your podcast until forever and ever. And if you're looking for the shortcut, for the actual exact blueprint of the things that you need to do in order for you to grow your podcast, and you don't have to overthink about anything, you don't have to put things together, you don't have to listen to a bunch of different content and different people tell you a bunch of things, then I'm happy to tell you that I have a program, which is basically not only my knowledge as a podcaster who started from the bottom, now we're here, and launched to an audience of 0, and now I have a top-ranking podcast, but also from the fact that I own a podcast management agency, and I have a lot of data from a lot of different podcasts that we manage every single month. So I basically know the algorithm inside and out because I'm very geeky, I'm very analytical, and I can reverse engineer like a boss. So all the knowledge that I have gathered from being a podcaster since 2020, plus owning a podcast management agency, I have put that together into a program, and that program is your shortcut. I promise you, if you follow those steps, you're going to see growth in your podcast. So as always, I will leave the information linked for you in the show notes so you can go check it out. Now get excited because next week I'm talking about podcasting mistakes and things that you need to fix in order for you to actually grow your listener base successfully. So make sure that you subscribe and that you check back in next week so you can see what those things are so that you can avoid making those mistakes and you can be super strategic about podcasting. Listen, if you get nothing from me, 2 things. 1 is that SEO is king when it comes to podcasting. And 2, you have to be strategic because podcasting works, but a lot of people fall out of love with podcasting because they think they can just pick up a mic and start talking and the leads are going to come in. And that's not it at all. You have to be strategic about the podcast episodes that you're putting out there. Until next time, may you find God's love, peace, grace, and mercy, and I'll see you then. Bye.